Abigail Carter didn't cry when they threw her belongings into the street. She picked up every last piece with her bare hands, lifted her chin, and walked, because crying meant they had broken her, and she refused to give Red Valley that satisfaction. She had nothing. No home. No name worth speaking. No one who would stand beside her. But somewhere across the Wyoming Valley, a man sat alone in a house too large for one heart, and neither of them knew yet that everything was about to change. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. The summer of 1881 came to Red Valley, Wyoming Territory, the way trouble always did, quietly without warning, wrapped in something that looked ordinary on the surface. The heat that July was the kind that pressed down on a person's shoulders like a hand pushing them into the earth. The kind that made the dust rise slow and golden off the main road and hang in the air as if it had nowhere better to be. The horses tied outside the general store stood with their heads low. Old men sat on the porch of Hattie's diner without saying much. Even the wind seemed to have given up. But inside the diner, nobody was quiet. "I heard she showed up with one bag and $3, said Margaret Holt, not bothering to lower her voice. She was seated at the counter with two other women, all of them stirring coffee that had long gone cold. $3, in a territory like this. She tried to apply for the school teacher position, said Dora Finch, pressing her lips together in a way that meant she had already rendered judgment. The position that wasn't even open yet. Bold, said the third woman, Ruth Calhoun. That's what they call it when it comes from a woman with nothing. Bold. She let the word fall like something she'd stepped over on the road. Abigail Carter heard every word. She was standing at the far end of the counter, waiting on her coffee order, with her hands folded in front of her, her back straight, her face composed into an expression she had spent years learning, the one that showed nothing. The one she'd built out of necessity, the way a person builds a wall out of whatever materials the land provides. She was 26 years old. She had dark brown hair pinned at the back of her neck, a plain traveling dress that had been washed so many times the color had faded to something between brown and gray, and eyes that missed very little. She'd arrived in Red Valley 2 weeks before on the morning stage carrying one leather satchel, $3.14, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of recommendation from the school board in Cheyenne that had closed the schoolhouse she'd taught in, closed it right out from under her, thanked her for her service, and handed her the letter, as though that made it decent. She'd gone to see Mayor Aldous Burke the morning after she arrived. She'd sat across from him in his small office above the land registry and laid the letter on his desk and explained her credentials. 4 years of teaching, commended record, capable of instructing children from primer through arithmetic and basic geography. The mayor had looked at the letter, looked at her, looked at the letter again. "We don't have a funded position at present, Miss Carter," he'd said. "I understand that, sir. I'm asking whether there's a possibility of establishing one the community would benefit from. The community's doing fine." He'd folded his hands over the letter as though returning it to her. "A woman in your situation might be better served seeking domestic employment. Mrs. Hanley at the boarding house is looking for kitchen help. A woman in your situation." 4 words. She'd understood exactly what he meant by them, and she'd thanked him politely, taken the letter back, and walked out into the heat. That had been 2 weeks ago. In those 2 weeks, Abigail Carter had done the following. She had taken a room at the boarding house, paying a week in advance with most of what remained of her money. She had sewed 2 torn shirts for Clarence Webb, the barber, for 20 cents. She had sat with old Mrs. Paulson for 3 afternoons, when the woman's rheumatism was bad, and her daughter was too occupied to visit, and she had read aloud from the Bible and a worn copy of Dickens, and had not charged anything for it. She had mended a torn harness for the livery stable, because she'd learned a great many practical things in the years before she became a teacher, and the liveryman had given her 50 cents and a look of confused appreciation. She had done all of this quietly, without asking for notice or gratitude. And still, every time she walked into Hattie's diner for her morning coffee, the women at the counter found things to say. $3, Margaret repeated, savoring it. Abigail picked up her coffee when Hattie set it down, dropped her coins on the counter, counting them out precisely, and turned to leave. "Miss Carter," It was Dora Finch turning on her stool, the way a woman does when she wants the satisfaction of watching her words land. "You've been asking around about teaching opportunities." "I have," Abigail said. "You ought to know the families here with children have standards. They want someone settled, someone from somewhere." Dora's gaze traveled over her in a practiced, unhurried way. "Someone with people." Abigail held the woman's eyes for a moment. Not long, not with any heat, just long enough to make it clear she'd heard. "Thank you for the counsel, ma'am," she said, and walked out. The sun hit her full in the face when she stepped onto the boardwalk. She stood there a moment with her coffee, letting the brightness settle, letting the words she would never say move through her and out the way she'd learned to do. She was not a woman who cried easily. She hadn't cried when the school board in Cheyenne gave her the letter. She hadn't cried when the man she'd been promised to a schoolteacher himself, a man named Gerald Marsh, had sent a message 3 years before, informing her that he had reconsidered, that he required a wife who came from better circumstances, that he wished her well. She hadn't cried then either. She had simply learned to carry the weight of it, the way you carry a stone in your boot. Aware of it, always adjusting your step accordingly. What she had not yet learned was how to stop hoping. That was the trouble. She was still hoping when 2 days later, the storm came. It arrived in the late afternoon without the usual warning. No long, slow build of clouds. No drop in the temperature that might give a person time to prepare. One moment, the sky was the flat white of a July afternoon, and the next, the wind came up hard from the northwest, and the clouds rolled in black and fast, and the rain started all at once heavy, and driving, the kind that found every gap and crack in a building's structure and made them known. Abigail was crossing the far end of Main Street when it broke. She ran for the nearest covered porch, pressing herself against the wall, watching the water come down in sheets. It was then she heard the sound. A woman screaming, not in fear, but in the particular anguish of someone watching something they love come apart. Abigail turned her head. 3 buildings down, on the upper floor of a narrow clapboard house, a section of roofing had given way under the weight of water and debris accumulated through the summer, and a portion of the ceiling had collapsed into the bedroom of a family named Gruber, a widow named Clara Gruber, and her 3 children. People were standing in the street watching. A man shouted something about fetching the carpenter. Another said the storm was too bad you couldn't get up there safely, they'd have to wait. Abigail set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and looked at the gap in the Gruber roof. She had climbed worse. She'd grown up on a failing homestead in eastern Kansas, and there wasn't a structure on that property she hadn't repaired with her own hands at one point or another. Sawed walls plank, roofing a stock pen that fell in every other winter. Her father had been a man of great principle and very little practical capability, and her mother had been the one who kept things standing, and Abigail had learned at her side. She crossed the street at a run, taking the side steps of the adjacent building 2 at a time, reaching the roofline, and moving carefully, testing each step along the peak toward the gap in the Gruber roof. The rain was blinding. The wood was slick. She flattened herself against the pitch of the roof, moving slow, and reached the edge of the collapse, and began doing what she could. Pulling the debris that was blocking the drainage, shifting the broken planking, using her weight to press one edge of the failed section back against the structure so the water would run away from the interior rather than into it. She couldn't fix it, she knew that, but she could reduce the damage until the carpenter came. She was 15 minutes into it, soaked through, hands bleeding at the knuckles from the rough wood, when she heard a voice from below. "Miss?" She didn't look down. She was braced against the pitch with one foot wedged against a beam and both hands occupied. "Miss, you need to come down from there." "I'm busy," she said. A pause. "The plank you're standing on is cracked at the center joint." She stopped, looked down at her feet. The man was right. She could see it now, that he'd named it a dark fracture running through the board she'd shifted her weight to without thinking. She moved her foot slowly back to solid purchase. "Thank you," she said without looking down yet. "You're welcome. Now will you come down?" "When I'm finished." Another pause, shorter this time. And then, to her considerable surprise, the man was beside her. He had come up from the far side, the side with the exterior ladder used for chimney access, which she hadn't thought to use. He was broad across the shoulders and long in the arm. and he moved on the roof with the easy confidence of a man who understood how to distribute his weight on uncertain surfaces. He looked at what she'd done, looked at what remained, and without saying anything further, took hold of the larger piece of failed planking that she hadn't been able to shift and moved it. They worked side by side for another 10 minutes, not speaking, while the rain hammered down on them both. When it was done as it could be without proper materials, she finally looked at him. How was tall. Dark-haired, wet through water running off the brim of a dark hat he'd somehow kept on through all of it. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent their days outside, not old, not young, somewhere in that middle territory that the Wyoming sun carved into a man, whether he liked it or not. His eyes, when he looked at her, were a color she couldn't quite name in the flat gray light of the storm. Dark blue, maybe, or something close to it. How was looking at her the way people in Red Valley generally did not look at her. Not assessing, not dismissing, just looking. Ethan Walker, he said. She knew the name. Everyone in Red Valley knew the name. Abigail Carter, she said. He nodded once like her name was a thing that settled somewhere and would stay there. Then he offered her his hand, his actual hand, palm up to help her down from the roof, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it and they came down together, at the bottom. Clara Gruber was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her youngest child against her hip, crying with relief. Abigail went to her immediately, putting her hands on the woman's shoulders. "The roof will hold for tonight," she said. "You need the carpenter first thing in the morning. The far beam is sound. The damage is in the secondary planking. It can be repaired." Clara Gruber gripped her hand. "How did you know to? I didn't know you could." "My mother taught me," Abigail said simply. "You're all right. The children are all right." She stayed another few minutes until Clara was calmer. When she turned back toward the street, Ethan Walker was still there. The rain had slowed to something manageable. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered was dispersing, people moving back to their own concerns. A few of them glanced at Abigail as they went with the specific expression of people recalibrating something privately. Ethan Walker stood with his hands in his coat pockets watching her. "You're the woman staying at Paulson's boarding house," he said. "I am." "The one who applied for the teaching position." "There wasn't a position," she said. "But yes." He looked at her for another moment in that direct, unhurried way. "Where'd you teach before?" "Cheyenne, 4 years." "Why'd you leave?" "The school closed. Budget." She met his gaze. "Are you conducting a formal inquiry, Mr. Walker, or—" "No," he said, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "No, ma'am, just asking." She studied him a moment. She'd heard what they said about Ethan Walker in town, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a man who kept to himself and trusted very few people, and had turned down every eligible woman the town had tried to present him with in the years since his father died and left him the Walker Ranch. They said he was proud. They said he was difficult. They said he'd never marry. Looking at him now, standing in the aftermath of a summer storm, with water dripping off his hat brim, she thought. What she actually saw was a man who had learned to need very little from other people. She recognized it because she'd spent years building the same thing in herself, stone by careful stone. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," she said, and meant to walk away. "Miss Carter." She stopped. "You left your coffee," he said. He was holding the cup she'd set on the porch railing. He'd retrieved it from somewhere in the chaos and was offering it to her, and it was such an unexpectedly small and ordinary gesture in the middle of everything that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. She took the cup. The coffee was long cold. "Thank you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked away through the settling rain. She thought about that moment more than she intended to in the days that followed. Not because it meant anything. She was not a woman who built castles from gestures, but because there was something in the quality of his attention that she kept returning to without meaning to. He had looked at her as though she were actually there. In Red Valley, that was rarer than she'd expected. She pushed it aside and went on with the work of surviving. 4 days after the storm, the trouble started. She didn't know it had begun until Clarence Webb the barber stopped her on the boardwalk and would not meet her eyes. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said, and then walked past her quickly in the manner of a man who has decided something and doesn't want to be talked out of it. At the boarding house, Mrs. Paulson was quieter than usual over breakfast. The other two boarders, a traveling seed merchant and an older man who'd come to the territory to file on a land claim, both left the table before she finished eating. By midday, she understood something was wrong. Margaret Holt intercepted her outside the general store. Margaret, who never missed an opportunity to observe and opine, now had the specific brightness in her face of a woman who is distressed and thrilled in equal measure. "Miss Carter," she said, "I don't suppose you've heard." "Heard what, Mrs. Holt?" Margaret pressed her lips together, achieving an expression of great reluctance that fooled neither of them. "People are saying now, I'm not saying I believe it, but people are saying that some items went missing from the Walker Ranch last night. A record ledger from the ranch office, some papers, and that one of the ranch hands saw a woman leaving the property before sunrise." Abigail felt the cold move through her, slow and precise, in the way that only the specific cold of an accusation can. "A woman," she said. "A woman in a gray-brown dress." Margaret's gaze moved over Abigail's dress with a delicacy that was perfectly cruel. "They're saying she was seen near the road that runs past the east pasture." "Is that all they're saying?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, which was itself an answer. "Mrs. Holt," Abigail said carefully, "what exactly is being said?" "They're saying," Margaret replied, dropping her voice to the register that carries furthest, "that you came to Red Valley with nothing, and that you made a point of getting close to Ethan Walker, and that now things have gone missing." She paused. "They're saying you're not what you presented yourself as." The boardwalk felt very still. Around them, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning on Main Street. The clop of horses, the bang of the general store's screen door, the distant sound of someone's chickens continued without interruption, indifferent to the fact that Abigail Carter's life in Red Valley was being quietly dismantled. She had been in this position before. Not this exactly, but near enough to recognize the shape of it. She knew how it went once a story was in the water it spread, and it didn't much matter whether the story was true. What mattered was whether you had anyone who would stand beside you in the face of it. She had no one in Red Valley. She had known that from the beginning. "Thank you for telling me directly, Mrs. Holt," she said, "because it was the true thing, and also the only civil thing. I didn't take anything from the Walker Ranch." "I'm sure you didn't," said Margaret Holt, in a tone that meant the opposite. She went to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Sheriff Tom Briggs was a compact man with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking at people and trying to figure them out. He had the look Abigail thought of a man who had once been fair-minded and had found the job difficult as a result. "Miss Carter," he said when she sat down across from his desk, "I was going to come find you." "I came to you," she said. "I understand I'm being connected to a theft at the Walker Ranch. I want to address it directly." Briggs folded his hands on the desk. "Were you on Walker property last night?" "No." "Can anyone confirm where you were?" "Mrs. Paulson at the boarding house. I was in my room the entire evening. I had supper in the kitchen and went upstairs before 8. She held his gaze. "I have no reason to go on to the Walker Ranch. I have no access to it. I have nothing to gain from a ledger I've never seen." "The ledger isn't just any ledger," Briggs said slowly. "It contains the deed records and cattle inventory for Walker property going back 3 years. Something like that in the wrong hands could be used to challenge a land claim, contest a boundary, create legal problems for the ranch." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific kind of trouble," she said. "Who would have reason to create that kind of trouble for Ethan Walker?" Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "That's a good question, Miss Carter." "Then perhaps that's the question worth asking," she said, "instead of the one about the woman in the brown dress." She left before he could respond, because she had learned a long time ago that the last word is not always worth the price of staying to say it. The evening of that same day, she was sitting on the small bench outside the boarding house going through her options with the methodical internal accounting she'd developed over years of precarious circumstances when she heard boots on the boards. She looked up. Ethan Walker stood at the foot of the boarding house steps. He had his hat in his hand. He turned it once by the brim, not looking at it, looking at her. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Walker. My foreman reported the missing items to the sheriff without talking to me first," he said. "By the time I heard what was being said about you, it was already in the street." He stopped, turned the hat once more. "I don't believe you took those things." Something tightened in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the anticipation of it, cautious and careful. "How would you know that?" she said. "Because I know what someone looks like when they're trying to get something from me," he said plainly. "And I know what you looked like on that roof in the rain, and it wasn't that." She studied him. "Mr. Walker, people are saying I came here to take advantage of your position. If you're seen defending me publicly, that will be said about you as well. You should know that before. I know what'll be said." His voice was even. Not hard, not soft, just certain. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was standing in it. "I've got a problem, Miss Carter. Somebody took those records. Somebody who knows what they're for and knows how to use them. That's not a drifter. That's not a school teacher from Cheyenne." He paused. "I need to know who it actually is, and I think you might be able to help me." She looked at him. "Why would you think that?" "Because the morning after the storm, before any of this started, you told Clara Gruber exactly which beam was sound and which planking needed replacing. You've got a way of seeing a structure and knowing immediately where the weakness is." He held her gaze. "I need that. On something that matters more than a roof." The lamp above the boarding house door threw a warm circle of light onto the steps between them. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped at a hitch. The evening settled around them, quiet and waiting. Abigail Carter had been offered very little in Red Valley. She had expected to earn everything slowly with her hands and her patience and the sort of careful invisibility that allowed a woman with no people and no money to survive in a place that hadn't asked for her. She had not expected this. She had not expected to be looked at by Ethan Walker as though she were actually capable of something. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," she said. He sat, and they began. She told him what she'd noticed, because she had noticed things the way she always did, out of the habit of observation that had been bred into her by necessity. Small things. The man she'd seen twice near the edge of town, who didn't match any ranch hand she'd been introduced to. The wagon that had been parked past the livery on 3 separate evenings, never with a driver visible. The way Mayor Burke's expression had shifted when Ethan Walker's name came up at the town meeting she'd attended. Her first week a meeting ostensibly about road maintenance that had beneath the surface seemed to be about something else entirely. Ethan listened without interrupting. That itself was notable. She was accustomed to being interrupted, to having her observations corrected or dismissed before they were complete. He sat with his forearms on his knees and listened to all of it, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "The wagon by the livery," he said. "You saw it 3 times. Tuesday, Thursday, and the night before the storm. After dark each time. Same wagon." "I believe so. Single draft horse. Gray. The left rear wheel had a distinctive repair. The rim had been replaced piecemeal, different metal. You could see the variation in the color even at distance." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd seen on the roof, recalibrating something privately. "I've seen that wagon," he said. "I know whose it is." "Whose?" Howe was quiet for a breath. "A man named Victor Lang. He runs a land brokerage out of Laramie. He's been making offers on property in this valley for 2 years, buying up homesteads from families who've had a bad season and can't hold on." He paused. "He made an offer on my ranch 18 months ago. I turned it down." "And the ledger that it was taken," Abigail said slowly. "The one with the deed records. If that information were misrepresented, if the boundaries shown in those records were used to file a competing claim. A man who knew how to work the land registry could create enough of a legal dispute to tie the ranch up for years," Ethan said. "Long enough to make it worth selling rather than fighting." The weight of it settled between them. "He needed the records to know exactly where to file," Abigail said, "so the dispute would look credible. And he needed them to disappear from my possession," Ethan said, so I couldn't use them to counter the claim quickly." He was quiet for a moment. "He's done it before. There's a family named Hendricks about 40 miles east. They lost their homestead 3 years ago to a boundary dispute that came out of nowhere. Went to court, couldn't afford to fight it, sold out at half value." He looked at her. "I couldn't prove Lang was behind it. Nobody could. But this time," Abigail said, "someone sent the blame toward me. Which means someone knew the records were going to go missing, and they needed a person to point to before the question was asked." "Someone who'd noticed you," Ethan said. "Someone who knew you had no people here, no one who'd stand up and call it a lie." The lamp flickered. Down the street, the saloon had gotten loud with the end of day. She was someone with no people. He was someone who didn't trust people. And between them, without either of them having chosen it, was the outline of something that needed doing. "Mr. Walker," she said, "if we're going to find out where those records went and who took them, we'll need to move carefully. Lang, if that's who's behind this, will have anticipated that you'd look into it." "He won't have anticipated you," Ethan said. She considered that. "No," she agreed. "I don't expect he will." Ethan Walker turned his hat in his hands one final time, then put it back on his head and stood. "I'll come for you tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. We'll start with the land registry." "All right," she said. He stepped off the porch, stopped, turned back. "Miss Carter." His voice was even, but there was something in it she hadn't heard there before, something careful, like a door opened just slightly. "What you did on that roof, with Clara Gruber. Nobody asked you to do that." She looked at him. Nobody needed to ask. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I reckon not." And then he walked away into the Wyoming night, and Abigail sat alone on the boarding house bench with the lamp burning above her, and the sound of the saloon carrying on the warm air, and for the first time since arriving in Red Valley, she did not feel entirely alone in it. She did not let herself make too much of that. But she noticed it. The way she noticed everything quietly, completely, and without yet knowing what it meant. Ethan Walker was at the boarding house before sunrise. Abigail heard his boots on the steps before she saw him. That particular deliberate tread, unhurried, but purposeful, the walk of a man who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. She was already dressed. She'd been awake since 4, going over everything she'd told him the night before, turning it the way you turn an object in your hands to look for what you missed. She came downstairs to find him standing in the front hall with his hat in his hand and Mrs. Paulson hovering in the doorway to the kitchen with an expression that was equal parts disapproval and fascinated curiosity. "I made coffee," Mrs. Paulson said to neither of them specifically. "Thank you, ma'am," Ethan said with a courtesy that seemed to disarm the older woman against her intentions. He looked at Abigail. "Ready?" "Yes," she said, and followed him out before Mrs. Paulson could organize her feelings into words. The morning was cool, and still the kind of quiet that belongs to the hour before a Wyoming summer reasserts itself. They walked side by side toward the land registry office at the east end of Main Street, and they walked fast, and the town around them was not yet awake enough to watch. "I need you to understand something before we go in," Ethan said without looking at her. "Ben Crocker runs the land registry. He's been in that office 11 years. He knows every deed, every filing, every boundary dispute in this valley." "And," Abigail said, "and 3 years ago he signed off on the boundary adjustment that cost the Hendricks family their homestead." He paused. "I don't know if he knew what he was signing. I don't know if he did it knowingly, but he signed it." She absorbed that. So he might be involved. Or he might be careless. Or he might be afraid. Ethan's jaw was set. "I want to know which one before I start asking him questions he might go and repeat to the wrong person." "Then let me watch him while you talk," Abigail said. "You ask the questions. I'll watch his face." He glanced at her sideways. "You think you can read a man in one conversation," he said. "I taught school for 4 years," she said. "Children lie with their whole body. Adults think they're better at it. They're not." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite the smile, that near territory of it she'd seen before. "All right," he said. Ben Crocker was unlocking the registry office when they arrived. He was a small, neat man of about 50, with careful hands and the perpetually apologetic bearing of someone who had spent decades in a position of minor authority and found it exhausting. He looked at Ethan Walker, and then at Abigail, and then back at Ethan. And his face did something complicated in the space of 1 second. Surprise followed by calculation, followed by the mask that covered both. I was afraid. Abigail saw it immediately. "Mr. Walker," Crocker said, "I wasn't expecting you." "No reason you would be," Ethan said pleasantly. "I need to look at the original filing records for my north boundary, the 1877 survey documents. The ones that set the line between my land and the federal grazing allotment." Crocker's hands had gone still on his keyring. "Those are archived records. It can take time to—" "I'll wait," Ethan said. Another moment of something moving behind Crocker's eyes. He nodded and went inside. Ethan followed. Abigail came in quietly and took a position near the wall slightly behind Ethan, where she could see Crocker's profile without being his focus. The office smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular dry mustiness of documents that have been handled many times. Crocker moved to the back shelves and began going through the filing boxes with an efficiency that spoke of genuine familiarity with the system. Whatever else he was, he knew these records. He pulled a folio and carried it to the front counter and opened it. And then she saw it, the slight hesitation, the fractional pause, as his eyes swept the contents of the folio before he turned it to face Ethan. He'd been checking something, making sure something was or wasn't there. Ethan studied the documents without speaking. Abigail watched Crocker watch Ethan and saw the sweat that had appeared at the man's temple despite the morning cool. "These are the originals," Ethan said. "Yes," Crocker said. "Stamped and witnessed 1877, as you can see. And the 1879 amendment, the one that added the northeast quarter." Crocker went very still. "The 1879 amendment," he repeated. "There was a boundary amendment filed in October 1879, Ethan said. "My father handled it. It should be in the same folio." "It may be in a separate filing." Crocker moved back to the shelves. "Let me check." He spent 4 minutes looking. In those 4 minutes, his movements changed, less efficient, more searching. And there was a quality to the search that Abigail recognized. It was the search of a man who is looking for something he suspects may no longer be there. He came back to the counter with empty hands. "I'll need to do a more thorough search," he said. "It may have been misfiled. These things happen over time." "When did you last pull these records?" Ethan said. The question landed with a quietness that was more precise than volume. It's been some time. I can't say exactly." "Has anyone else requested access to these files recently?" Crocker's hands flattened on the counter. "Mr. Walker, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Ethan said. "I'm asking a direct question. Has anyone requested access to the original boundary filings for Walker Ranch in the past 30 days? The silence stretched out between them like a rope pulled tight. "One inquiry," Crocker said finally in a voice that had lost most of its air. "A legal representative. Said he was conducting a title search for a prospective buyer." "Did he give a name?" "He gave a firm name, Laramie-based. I wrote it somewhere." Crocker was already moving. Opening the ledger on his desk, running his finger down the entries, and his finger stopped. He looked up. His face had gone a particular color. "The entry's been removed," he said. Abigail's gaze moved to Ethan. His expression had not changed. Still, that level stillness that she was learning meant he was most alert when he appeared most calm. "Removed," Ethan said. The ink has been gone over. Someone used a chemical agent on the entry." Crocker's voice had dropped to something barely audible. That's a federal offense. Tampering with land registry records is a—" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "It is." Crocker looked at him with the expression of a man standing on the edge of something he has been avoiding for a long time. "Mr. Walker, I want you to know that I did not, when I processed that inquiry, I had no reason to—" "I believe you," Ethan said. The 3 words fell into the room and stilled it. Crocker blinked as if he hadn't expected them. "I need one thing from you," Ethan continued. I need you to write down everything you remember about the man who came in. Everything. What he looked like, what he said, whether he touched those files, how long he was here. Write it down and seal it and give it to no one but me or Sheriff Briggs. Can you do that? Crocker swallowed. Yes, he said. Yes, I can do that. They left him to it and walked back out into the morning, which had gotten warmer in the time they'd been inside. The 1879 amendment, Abigail said. What's in it? Ethan's voice was controlled, but not entirely even. My father filed it after a survey dispute with a neighbor. It officially recorded a boundary extension 40 acres along the North Creek. Good water access. Without that document, someone could claim the amendment was never legal. That the original 1877 boundary is the binding one. And the 40 acres would be in dispute. He paused. The creek runs through them. Without that water access, the north pasture isn't viable for cattle. Abigail walked beside him and thought about what Crocker's face had told her, and what the missing entry had told her, and what it meant that someone had gone to the trouble of not only taking the ledger from the Walker Ranch, but also erasing the record of their own inquiry at the registry. That was careful. That was planned. This isn't opportunistic, she said. No. Ethan agreed. Whoever is doing this has been building it for some time. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The Hendricks family 3 years ago, do you know what boundary line they lost? He looked at her. Creek access, he said slowly. The same pattern, she said. Create a document dispute. Let the legal cost wear the owner down. Buy at distressed price. She met his eyes. What if the Hendricks land and your North acres together would give someone control of the primary water source for this entire section of the valley? The implication of it opened between them. Whoever holds that water, Ethan said very quietly, holds every ranch in a 30-mile radius. He turned and looked back at the registry office behind them. Then he looked forward down the long, dusty length of Main Street, past the buildings and the hitching posts and the ordinary morning commerce toward something neither of them could see yet, but could now feel the shape of. We need to find where he took those records, Ethan said. Victor Lang operates out of Laramie, Abigail said. But a man like that, if he's working this valley over 2 or 3 years, he'd need somewhere closer. Somewhere to manage it from. A place that doesn't draw attention. There's an old way station, Ethan said. About 8 miles northeast. It's been derelict for years. Nobody goes out there. She looked at him. How do you know about it? Because Lang's wagon, he said, uses the northeast road when it comes into town. I've seen the track it leaves. He paused, and there was something in his expression, a recalibration, the look of a man adding things up and not liking the sum. I saw it and thought nothing of it. It's my own land it runs along the edge of. She said nothing for a moment. Then, when do we go? He looked at her then fully, with that direct steadiness that she'd decided was simply the way he occupied space in the world. You don't have to come. I found the wagon, she said. I know what the wheel looks like. You might need that identification. A beat. It's not safe. Mr. Walker, she said. I've been accused of theft by half this town. My landlady won't look at me directly. And the only person in Red Valley who currently believes I'm telling the truth is standing in front of me. I am aware that things are not safe. She held his gaze. I'm coming. He was quiet for a second. Tomorrow, he said. Before light. She nodded. He walked away toward the livery, and she stood for a moment on the boardwalk while the town moved around her and felt the particular sensation of a thing in motion that cannot now be stopped. What happened that afternoon stopped them both. She was returning from Mrs. Paulson's boarding house after a midday meal that was eaten mostly in silence when she saw the group of people gathered outside the sheriff's office. That kind of gathered cluster meant something specific in a small town. It had the shape of something official, being witnessed a thing that had been decided and was being made public. She slowed her steps. Standing at the center of the gathering was Sheriff Briggs. Beside him was a man she didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed for the territory, with a lawyer's deliberate composure and a leather document case tucked under his arm. And beside him, speaking to Briggs with the measured tone of a man presenting something straightforward, was Mayor Aldous Burke. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see, because she always saw the way Burke's eyes moved through the crowd and stopped when they found her. He said something quietly to the man with the document case. The man looked at her. She kept walking. Past the gathering, past the sheriff's office, around the corner, and out of the line of sight. And then she stopped and put her back against the wall of the hardware store and breathed. They had filed something. She could feel it in the way the lawyer had looked at her, the specific look of a man who has just been told who the inconvenient party is. She needed to get to Ethan. She found him at the livery where he'd been seeing to one of his horses that had thrown a shoe on the way into town. He looked at her face when she came through the door and straightened immediately. "What happened?" he said. She told him what she'd seen. He listened without speaking, his jaw tightening by degrees. "A lawyer from Laramie," he said, "with documents. Whatever they filed, it's already done." She kept her voice level. "They're moving faster than I expected." He turned and said something brief to the liveryman, who nodded and took the horse's lead. Then he came toward her, and his stride had changed, still controlled, but with an urgency underneath it that hadn't been there before. "I need to see Briggs," he said. "If you go to Briggs now in front of that crowd—" "I know." He stopped, looked at her. "What would you do?" The question surprised her, not because it was asked, but because of how it was asked. Genuinely, as if he expected a useful answer. She thought for 3 seconds. "Don't go to Briggs in public. Go to Crocker. Find out if anything was filed with the land registry today before you respond to whatever's been said at the sheriff's office. If you react before you know what the filing actually says, you give them the advantage." He looked at her for a moment. "Crocker will tell me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think he will." He went. She waited. Howe was back in 20 minutes, and the lines of his face had sharpened into something she hadn't seen on him before. "They filed a boundary dispute," he said when he reached her, claiming the 1879 amendment was improperly executed, that it was witnessed by a party with a conflict of interest and therefore invalid. They're seeking to revert the boundary to the 1877 original. "And the North 40 acres are now in legal dispute." His voice was flat. "The filing was made by a holding company out of Laramie. Lang's company, I'd stake my life on it. But his name isn't on it." "It won't be," she said. "Men like that never put their name on the first document." Howe was quiet for a long moment, standing in the partial shade at the side of the livery, and she could see him working through it. The particular internal grappling of a man who has built something over years and is watching someone try to take it apart with paperwork. "This changes the timetable," he said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "We need to find those records, not in a few days. Now." He met her eyes. "Tonight," he said. She hadn't expected that. "It'll be dark in 4 hours," she said. "I know the Northeast Road better than anyone." His voice was level. "The way station's derelict, no one there after dark. If those documents are there, tonight's the cleanest time to look." She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "All right," she said. He looked at her, as if he was going to say something further, something more personal, she thought, something that pressed against the practical boundary of their arrangement. But whatever it was, he kept it. "Meet me at the north end of town," he said. 2 hours after dark. Come quiet." He walked away, and she went back to the boarding house to wait, and the afternoon was the longest 4 hours she could remember in recent years. Howe was already there when she arrived, standing beside 2 horses at the edge of the road, where the last building of Red Valley ended and the territory proper began. He had brought a horse for her, a quiet bay that stood steady while she mounted, and he didn't make a remark about whether she could ride, which she appreciated. They rode northeast in silence and darkness. He set a pace that was fast, but not reckless, and she matched it without difficulty, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who have agreed on a direction and are pursuing it. After a while he spoke. "You rode before," he said, "not a question." "Kansas homestead," she said. "We had 2 horses. I learned early." A pause. "You thought I might not be able to?" "I thought it was possible," he said with a plainness that was in itself a kind of honesty. A lot of women from town backgrounds aren't comfortable on horseback after dark in rough country. I'm not from a town background. No, he said. I'm coming to understand that. They rode another mile before she said, "How long since you've had anyone to talk to out here, actually talk to?" The question came out more direct than she'd intended. She heard him absorb it. "Some time," he said finally. "Your foreman. Jake's a good man. We talk about cattle and fences and weather." A pause. Not a great deal else. She understood that. The particular silence that descends when there's no one in your life who asks the harder question. She'd lived in it for years. "My father used to say that the territory does two things to a person," Ethan said after a moment. "It either opens them up or it closes them down, depending on who they started as." "Which did it do to you?" she said. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I started out more open than I ended up," he said. She didn't ask what had closed him. It wasn't the time, and she didn't have the standing. But she understood the answer in a way she could have explained at length if anyone had asked, which no one had. They reached the way station a little before midnight. It was a collection of three structures. The original relay building, a timber frame that had lost most of its outer cladding to weather, and two outbuildings of varying degrees of collapse. The kind of place that had stopped meaning something to anyone in particular years ago, which made it perfect for a purpose that needed to be invisible. Ethan dismounted first and tied the horses well back out of any line of sight from the main structure. He moved with a quiet she recognized as practiced a man who had moved through darkness on his own property often enough to know how. She stayed close behind him. The door to the main structure was not locked, which itself was information. A derelict building didn't need to stay accessible. She filed that away. Inside, it was darkness over darkness. Ethan had brought a shielded lantern, and he opened the slide, the minimum necessary enough to see shapes, not enough to throw light that might carry. She saw it within 30 seconds. It was not a ransacked space. It was organized. There were two crates along the far wall, a table with papers laid flat on it, and a wooden box that had been built into the corner with a simple hasp and lock. None of this was the accumulation of a man who used this space occasionally. This was a working location. "Here," she said quietly, moving to the table. The documents on the table were copies, not originals. She could tell by the paper quality, but they were copies of boundary records. Multiple ranches, multiple families. She recognized two names from conversations she'd had in town. The Grubers, a family called Mercer. "He's not just after your land," she said. Ethan came to stand beside her and looked at what she was looking at. He was very still for a moment. "He's mapping the whole valley," he said. "He's been doing it for years," she said, methodically. She picked up a document carefully, an annotated map, hand-drawn with the creek system marked in red, and parcels shaded in a progression that clearly indicated acquisition priority. "He's building toward the creek. Every acquisition is one step closer." "And mine is the last piece," Ethan said. "Yours and the Hendricks land," she said. "If he holds both of those together." A sound from outside. They both went still simultaneously, the absolute stillness of people who have spent time in circumstances where being heard has consequences. The sound was hooves. Not one horse. Multiple. Ethan moved to the narrow window in 3 steps and looked out through the gap in the cladding. She was beside him. 3 riders. Approaching at a walk. They hadn't seen the light. The shielding had done its work, but they were coming directly to the way station, which meant they were expected to be here, which meant they come here regularly, she breathed. Ethan had already made the calculation. He closed the lantern slide completely, and the darkness dropped over them like a physical thing. "Back corner," he said against her ear. "Away from the door. Move." She moved. They pressed into the corner behind the crates, and she felt his hand find her arm in the dark. Not roughly, but with a steadiness that was in itself a kind of communication stay. "Still I'm here, stay still." And she did. The door opened. One man came in first, carrying a lamp of his own. He was heavy-set with a mustache she could see from 15 feet away. He went directly to the table, looked at the documents arranged there, and turned back to say something to the men behind him. "Lang'll want the Walker filing confirmed before he comes himself," the heavy-set man said. "Make sure the copies are accurate before we move them." "What about the woman?" said a second voice from someone Abigail couldn't see yet. "That was Burke's idea. Point the town at her keep. Walker too busy defending her to pay attention to what's actually happening." A pause. "Don't know that it'll hold. Walker doesn't strike me as a man who gets distracted." "He's never had anyone to get distracted over before," said the second voice, with a flatness that meant something the heavy-set man didn't bother answering. Abigail felt Ethan beside her in the dark go absolutely rigid. Not with fear, with something colder and more deliberate than that. She put her hand on his arm, the same kind of pressure he'd used on her. "Stay still." "Not yet." She felt him hold. The men spent 20 minutes at the table. She cataloged everything she could in the dark, the heavy-set man's voice, his way of speaking. The second man's accent, which was Laramie, if she'd heard it once. The third man said nothing at all, which was itself notable. She counted the documents they handled by sound, the particular rustle of papers being examined, the sound of something being set into a box. Then they left. She and Ethan did not move for 3 full minutes after the hoofbeats faded. When he finally opened the lantern slide, his face in the thin light had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. A controlled fury held so tightly it barely showed, but she was close enough to see it. "Burke," he said. "The mayor. He suggested using me as the diversion," she said. "He knew," Ethan said. "He wasn't careless. He knew what was happening, and he helped Lang do it." His voice was not loud. It was the quiet of a man deciding something. "He used you specifically, because you had no one here." She was quiet for a moment. She'd suspected something like this, suspected it from the particular comfort with which Burke had dismissed her that first morning, but hearing it confirmed in someone else's words had a specific quality. A solidifying of something that had only been a shape before. "What do we have?" she said, forcing herself back to the practical. "Copies of the documents he took from the ranch," Ethan said. He was moving through the papers quickly, efficiently, with a decisiveness that had replaced the fury, or perhaps contained it. "The annotated map. The correspondence, look at this." He held up a folded letter half opened. "This is Lang's letterhead." She took it and read. It was addressed to Burke. It detailed a payment schedule. The language was careful legally. Indirect, the kind of language a man who uses lawyers writes when he wants to pay a bribe without using that word. But the meaning was clear. "We can't take these," she said. He looked at her. "If we take them, they'll know we were here," she said. "And they'll move everything before we can use it. We need these to still be here when the right person comes to look." She paused. "We need Briggs." "Briggs might be in it too." "I don't think so," she said. "I watched his face when you were asking him questions, and he wasn't performing, he was genuinely confused. Burke was performing. Crocker was afraid. Briggs was actually trying to understand." She met his eyes. "He's not clever enough to be that good a liar." He was quiet for a second. "That's not a ringing endorsement of a man's character." "No," she agreed. "But it might make him the most trustworthy person in Red Valley right now." He looked at the documents spread on the table. He looked at the corner where they'd stood together in the dark while 3 men talked about using her and didn't know she could hear them. He looked at her. "They said I've never had anyone to get distracted over," he said. She waited. "That's not something a man says about a business arrangement," he said. "Lang's been watching me, watching us, which means they've already decided what you are to me." She said carefully, "And what is that?" He picked up the annotated map, looked at it once more, set it back exactly as he'd found it. "The person they can hurt," he said, "to get to me." She understood what he wasn't saying. Not just the danger, the specific danger to her which she'd already assessed, but the other thing. The admission that was inside it. The shape of something neither of them had named. She did not press it. She had learned not to push open doors that needed to open in their own time. "Then we need to move carefully," she said. "Both of us." "Together," he said. "Not a question." "Together," she said. They rode back to Red Valley in the dark. The night was warm and full of insect sound, and the enormous unfenced silence of the Wyoming Territory, pressing in on all sides, and they rode close enough that sometimes her arm brushed his, and neither of them moved away. When the lights of the town appeared ahead of them, Ethan slowed the horses. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to Briggs." "Yes," she said. "And tonight will you be all right at the boarding house, if they have someone watching you?" "I'll be fine," she said. He looked at her in the way he had on the roof in the rain, not assessing, not calculating, something more than that, and something harder to categorize. "Miss Carter," he said. "Abigail," she said. She didn't know exactly why. It came out before she'd decided on it. The space between one breath and the next. "Abigail," he said. The word sat differently in his mouth than it had in anyone else's. More careful, like something worth keeping. "Good night, Mr. Walker," she said, and turned her horse toward the boarding house before the warmth in her chest could build into something she'd have to think too carefully about. She heard him very quietly behind her. "Good night," and then the sound of his horse moving away toward the livery. She did not look back. She wanted to. That she decided as she rode the last 2 blocks alone was perhaps the most honest thing she'd felt in a very long time. Part 3. Lưu ý viết 4 nạn nhân nôm mà mòn chăn từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 3, đạt điểm 10/10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lần màn kết thúc phần, không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mức document mỗi 2 phút cần có mini climax và đạt 10-15 mini climax mỗi phần cử. 10-12 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, thăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8-10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nha. Show more. Sheriff Tom Briggs listened to all of it without saying a word. That itself was something. Abigail had expected interruptions, the reflexive pushback of a man whose authority was being implicitly questioned, whose territory had been operated in without his knowledge. But Briggs sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving between the two of them, and he let them finish. Ethan laid it out plainly. The missing ledger, the erased registry entry, the way station, the documents, the annotated map, the letter on Lang's letterhead addressed to Burke, the 3 riders. What the heavy-set man had said about Burke, suggesting Abigail as the diversion. When Ethan stopped talking, the office was quiet enough that Abigail could hear the clock on the wall. Briggs looked at her. "You heard this yourself." "I was 6 feet away," she said, "and you didn't take anything from that building." "We left everything exactly as we found it." Briggs nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "Burke," he said. Just the name, flatly, the way a man says a word he's been half expecting and still doesn't like the taste of. "The payment schedule in that letter goes back 14 months, Ethan said. "He's been on Lang's payroll since before the boundary filing." "I need to see those documents," Briggs said. "Then you need to move today," Abigail said. "Those men came to the way station to check on the copies. Once they're satisfied everything is in order, they'll move them before the filing goes to contest. If Lang's timetable is what I think it is, he files the formal challenge within the week." Briggs looked at her with the expression she'd come to associate with men reassessing a prior underestimation. "You know land law, Miss Carter." "I know enough," she said. "My father lost a homestead to a bad title when I was 12. I paid attention." That landed in the room with a weight she hadn't intended. She saw Ethan beside her absorb it without turning his head. Briggs stood. "I'll need a deputy I trust. That's a short list right now." He was already moving toward the hook where his coat hung. "Walker, I need you to stay out of sight today. If Burke sees you coming and going from this office, he'll know something's shifted." "Agreed," Ethan said. "And you." Briggs looked at Abigail. "You particularly. If Lang has someone watching—" "He does," she said. "The third man at the way station didn't speak. That's not a man there to work. That's a man there to observe." Briggs stared at her for a moment. "All right," he said in the tone of a man who has revised his estimate and is working with the new number. "Go back to the boarding house, both of you, separately. I'll come to you, Walker, at the ranch before noon." They left the sheriff's office 2 minutes apart, Ethan first, Abigail after. She walked back to the boarding house on the opposite side of Main Street, taking the longer way, and did not look at anything directly. A skill she'd developed over years of being in places where she'd needed to observe without appearing to. She saw the third man immediately. He was sitting outside the barber shop with a newspaper he wasn't reading. He was watching the sheriff's office. He tracked Ethan's departure, then her own, with the professional patience of someone paid to wait and watch. He did not move from his position. She went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed. They were being watched. Which meant Lang already suspected something had shifted. Which meant Briggs had less time than he thought. She got up and began to write. She had the document finished in 40 minutes, a careful, methodical account of everything she had observed from the morning at the land registry through the previous night at the way station. Every detail she could recover: the heavy-set man's face, his voice, the precise language he'd used about Burke, the items she'd seen on that table, the annotated map and its color-coded parcels, the letterhead on the correspondence. She wrote it the way she'd learned to write the things that mattered. Spare, precise, every claim confined to what she had directly witnessed, nothing extrapolated or assumed. Then she copied it. Twice. 3 different copies, 3 different hiding places in the room, one folded into the spine of her Bible, the way her mother used to hide the important papers when the situation required it. If something happened to her, if Lang's man outside made a move before Briggs could act, at least what she knew would still exist somewhere. She was sealing the 3rd copy when a knock came at her door. She was on her feet before the second knock. "Who is it?" "Clara Gruber." She opened the door. Clara Gruber was standing in the hallway with her youngest child on her hip and an expression that walked the edge between frightened and determined. She was the woman whose roof Abigail had helped patch the widow 3 children narrow-clapboard house at the end of Main Street. "They came to see me this morning," Clara said without preamble. 2 men. One of them was a lawyer type. "They asked me about you." Abigail held the door wider. "Come in." Clara came in and sat on the single chair and held her child and talked. The men had asked whether Abigail had ever spoken to her about Ethan Walker's property, whether Abigail had asked questions about the land in the valley, whether she'd shown any interest in the Walker Ranch specifically. The questions were framed carefully formally, in a way that Clara had recognized as designed to produce a specific kind of answer. "I told them no," Clara said, "because the answer is no. All you ever did was fix my roof when nobody else was going to." She paused. "But I want to know what's happening, because they're going to come back, and the next time the questions might not be as easy to answer no to." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. She had not trusted many people in Red Valley. She had not had occasion to. But Clara Gruber had 3 children and a widow's particular understanding of what it cost to be on the wrong side of powerful men. And there was a quality to her that Abigail recognized, the quality of a woman who had already decided what she stood for and was not going to unmake that decision under pressure, she told her. Not everything, not the way station, not the specifics of what they'd found, but the shape of it. Lang, Burke, the water rights, the pattern across the valley. Clara listened the way Briggs had without interrupting. When Abigail finished, she was quiet for a moment, rocking the child on her hip with a small automatic motion. "My husband's name is on one of those parcels you're describing," she said. "Was I mean? He filed on it the year before he died. I've been paying the annual fee to hold the claim. I always thought someday maybe—" She stopped. "If Lang gets the creek access, my claim is worthless. The water runs through the northeast corner." "I know," Abigail said. Clara looked at her. "What do you need?" I need you to let me know immediately if those men come back, Abigail said. And I need you to go nowhere alone today. Is there someone you trust? Hattie, Clara said. From the diner. She's known me since I came to Red Valley. Stay with Hattie today. Both of you stay visible in public. They won't do anything in front of witnesses. She paused. And Clara, don't go to the mayor. Clara's jaw set in a way that said she'd already understood that. I wouldn't have, she said. I never liked the way that man listened. She left. Abigail stood at the window carefully to the side of the frame where she could see the street without being seen from it and checked the position of the man outside the barber shop. Still there, still watching. She needed to get a message to Ethan. She went out the back way through the kitchen where Mrs. Paulson was rolling pastry and pretending not to be aware of every movement in the house, out through the delivery entrance along the alley behind the east row of buildings. The long way to the livery, the way that did not cross Main Street. She did not look back. If she were being followed, looking back would confirm she knew it. She found Jake Mercer, Ethan's foreman, at the livery. She'd never spoken to him before, but she knew who he was. She'd cataloged every person connected to Ethan Walker in her first week in town out of the same habit of observation that was now the most useful thing she possessed. Jake Mercer was a withered man in his late 40s, with the hands of someone who'd been doing physical work since he was a boy, and the eyes of someone who had learned to take the measure of people efficiently. He looked at her when she came through the livery door, and he did not look friendly, but he did not look hostile either. He looked, she thought, like a man who was waiting to know what he was dealing with. You're Jake Mercer, she said. You're the school teacher, he said. I need to get a message to Mr. Walker, not through Main Street, not through anyone who might pass it on before it arrives. Jake looked at her for a long moment, his hand still on the leather he'd been working. What kind of message? The kind that needs to reach him in the next hour, she said. Before Sheriff Briggs does. Something moved in Jake's expression, a recalibration the same kind she'd seen in Briggs and Crocker. She was getting accustomed to it. Why before Briggs? Because there's something I didn't tell Briggs this morning. Something I want Ethan to know first. Jake sets down the leather. What is it? She looked at him steadily. Tell him Lang's man is watching the sheriff's office. And tell him that if Briggs goes to the way station in daylight with a deputy, Lang will know before they get there. Jake was very still for a moment. Then he turned and began saddling a horse with the decisiveness of a man who'd already made up his mind. I'll ride out now, he said. You go back to the boarding house, the back way. I know the back way, she said. I reckoned you did. He glanced at her, and there was something in it, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of its possibility. He talks about you, Jake said. Ethan, he doesn't talk about people. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did the practical thing and left. By midday, the configuration of the situation had changed. Ethan arrived at the boarding house himself, not through the front, but through the kitchen entrance, the way she'd used to exit. He appeared in the doorway while she was sitting at the narrow table in her room, with her notes spread out in front of her, and the sight of him, that particular decisive directness with which he occupied any space, steadied something in her that had been holding itself very carefully all morning. Jake told me, he said. He was looking at her notes on the table. Is that what I think it is? Everything I observed in order, she said. I have 3 copies, if something happens. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said. It came out with a certainty that was not quite a statement, and not quite a promise, something between the two. You can't guarantee that, she said. No, he admitted. But I can make it a great deal harder. He moved to the table and looked at the notes properly. His face changed as he read, a controlled sharpening the expression of a man, processing a large amount of information and finding the significant pieces. Lang's man watching the office, he said. You're right. If Briggs moves in daylight, Lang gets advance notice, and those documents are gone before the sheriff touches them. Briggs needs to go tonight, she said, without any obvious preparation beforehand. No visible gathering of deputies, nothing that could be watched and reported. I talked to Briggs after Jake reached me, Ethan said. He's agreed. 2 deputies he trusts at the way station after dark. He'll take sworn statements on the documents in situ. He paused. There's something else. The quality of his voice had shifted. She looked up from the notes. I sent word to the Territorial Marshal's office this morning, he said. Before we went to Briggs, I had Jake ride to the telegraph before sunrise. She stared at him. You didn't tell me that. No, he said. Because I didn't know if Briggs was trustworthy. If he wasn't, if he was also in Lang's pocket, I needed to know there was a higher authority already moving. He held her gaze. I made a decision without consulting you. I'm telling you now. She was quiet for a moment, assessing that. The decision itself was sound. She might have made the same one. But he'd made it unilaterally, which meant he'd weighted his own judgment over their partnership at the first significant moment. How long has the marshal had the information? She said. Since about 4 this morning. What information specifically? Long's name, the pattern of acquisitions, the Hendricks case, the boundary filing. He paused. Your name and the false accusation. She looked at him. Why my name? Because they used you, he said. It was simple and direct, and carried underneath it something that was not simple at all. Whatever else this is, they looked at you and decided you were someone who couldn't fight back. I wanted that on record with someone who has the power to make them answer for it. She was quiet for 3 seconds. The window let in the sound of Main Street going about its midday business, unaware of what was moving beneath the surface of the ordinary day. All right, she said. You're not angry. I would have done the same, she said, if I'd had access to a telegraph at 4 in the morning. She looked down at her notes. When does the marshal respond? Possibly today, more likely tomorrow morning. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Abigail, there's something you need to know before tonight. That particular gravity in his voice. Tell me, she said. The Hendricks family that lost their homestead 3 years ago, he said. The creek boundary dispute, the pattern you identified. He stopped. I knew James Hendricks. He was a friend. He came to me when the dispute started, asked if I could help, if I could speak to the legitimacy of the boundary, whether my family's records showed what his survey showed. He paused. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't do it fast enough. By the time I'd found anything useful in my father's records, the case had gone to judgment and the Hendricks had already sold out. I was looking at the table, not at her. I told myself I couldn't have done more, he said. That it was a legal matter, that the courts had ruled that there was nothing left to contest. I told myself that for 3 years. His jaw was tight. If I'd moved faster, if I'd taken it as seriously in the first week as I did in the third. You didn't know then what we know now, she said. I should have known something, he said. James Hendricks was my friend, and I let the paperwork swallow him because I didn't push hard enough. He looked up, then directly at her. I'm not going to do that again. The weight of what he was actually saying. What the loss of the Hendricks family homestead had cost him privately, the guilt he'd carried in silence for 3 years, the way it had likely contributed to the particular closed quality she'd first noticed in him, settled into the room with them. She said after a moment, Is that what you're doing? Making sure this time is different? Partly, he said. Then quieter. And partly, I just don't want anything to happen to you. The directness of it was not what she expected. He was not a man who arrived at personal statements by a wandering route. When he said a thing, it was because he'd already decided it was true and worth saying. She had come to understand that about him. She said carefully, Mr. Walker. Ethan, he said. A breath. Ethan, she said. He looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the thing between them that had been building in accretion, on a roof in a rainstorm, on a dark road northeast in the back corner of a derelict building, with 3 men 10 feet away, was fully present in the room. Then boots on the stairs. Both of them heard it. She moved the notes off the table into her lap. He straightened. The knock at the door was Briggs's knock. She already knew his cadence from the sheriff's office that morning. She opened the door. Briggs came in with his hat in his hand, and his expression arranged into the specific, careful blankness of a man carrying news he hasn't fully processed yet. We have a problem, he said. The problem was Burke. Specifically, Burke had gone to the way station. One of Briggs's trusted deputies, a young man named Cale Adder, who was trusted because he was only 3 weeks in the position and hadn't been in Red Valley long enough to be bought, had been quietly watching Burke's movements since that morning. An hour ago, Burke had left his office by the back entrance, taken a horse from the far end of town, and ridden northeast. "He's already gone," Abigail said. "Left 40 minutes ago," Briggs confirmed. Cale followed him to the edge of the northeast road and came back to report. "He's warning them," Ethan said. "Someone told him we went to you." "Or someone saw Miss Carter at the livery this morning," Briggs said. He looked at her without accusation, purely informational. "You were seen." She filed that away for later. "If Burke warns Lang's people, they'll move the documents tonight. Which means we need to move right now," Ethan said. "Not after dark, now." Briggs shook his head. "In daylight with Burke already out there." "Burke being out there is the problem regardless," Ethan said. "If we wait until dark, those documents are gone. If we go now, we might catch Burke at the station. Which gives us something we didn't have this morning: the mayor of Red Valley in person, at the location where evidence of his bribery is stored." The room held that for a moment. Briggs said slowly, "If Burke is there when we arrive." "Then the document in that box doesn't just implicate him," Abigail said. "His presence there implicates him. A man who goes to a derelict way station 40 minutes after the sheriff begins asking questions about that location. A man who has no legitimate reason to be there. Is a man who's hard to explain away in court," Briggs finished. He put his hat back on. "I've got Cale and one other I trust. Walker, you come. Miss Carter." "I'm coming," she said. "It's not—" "I know what the wheel on that wagon looks like," she said. "I can identify the documents on site. I wrote the account that will become part of your sworn record, and I will stand behind it in person." She looked at him directly. "I'm coming, Sheriff." Briggs looked at Ethan. "She comes," Ethan said. They rode hard. They covered the 8 miles in less time than it had taken in darkness the night before, pushing the horses on the open track, and the summer heat was full and pressing, and the light was flat and bright, and there was nowhere to hide the fact of their movement. She rode beside Ethan and slightly behind, with Briggs ahead and the 2 deputies flanking. She was aware of every beat of the horse under her, and the motion of the air, and the way the northeast track rose and curved before it dropped towards the cluster of structures that marked the way station. Ethan's hand went up a single short gesture. Everyone slowed. Below, at the way station, there were 3 horses tied outside the main structure. One of them was the gray with the distinctive repaired wheel, not a horse, but the wagon it belonged to, parked to the south side of the building. A second animal she didn't recognize. And a third, a brown mare with a red-banded saddle that was specific enough to be identifiable, and that she had seen, she was certain, tied outside the mayor's office on her first morning in Red Valley. Burke was already there. Briggs took in the 3 horses with one sweeping look. "We go straight in," he said. "No circling, no waiting. I don't want anyone out a back window before we reach the door." They went straight in. The sound of hooves brought someone to the window. She saw the movement of a face disappearing from the gap in the cladding. And then they were at the door, and Briggs was off his horse with his hand on his firearm and his deputy at his left shoulder, and he hit the door with the flat of his hand, and it swung open. 3 men inside. The heavy-set man from the previous night, whose name she would learn within the hour, was Garth Pelham Lang's chief operative in the territory. A younger man she hadn't seen before. And Mayor Aldous Burke standing beside the table with a stack of documents in his hands that he had clearly been in the process of removing. The expression that crossed Burke's face in that single second was one she would remember precisely: the expression of a man watching the story he'd been telling himself collapse all at once. "Sheriff Briggs," Burke said. And then, with the trained recovery of a career politician, "I had information that there may be illegal activity at this location. I came to investigate on behalf of the town's interest." "Mayor Burke," Briggs said, "put down those documents. These are—" "Put them down." Burke put them down. He did it slowly, like a man hoping the action might be undone if performed carefully enough. Briggs moved to the table. He looked at the documents, looked at the box in the corner, looked at the annotated map, still spread flat, as Abigail and Ethan had left it the night before. He looked at Pelham, who had gone very still in the way of a man calculating his options and finding them limited. "Garth Pelham," Briggs said. "You're a long way from Laramie." Pelham said nothing. "Deputy Adder," Briggs said, "you'll take note of the following inventory." What followed was 40 minutes of methodical, painstaking documentation. Briggs moved through this the way a man does when he knows he will be testifying to this later, careful, thorough narrating each item aloud for Cale Adder to write down. The letter on Lang's letterhead with Burke's name on it. The annotated map. The boundary records that match the filings in Crocker's registry. The ledger pages from Ethan's ranch records, still bound with the original ribbon and stamped with the Walker brand mark that had been on every ranch document since Ethan's father established the operation in 1869. She identified the documents as they were inventoried. Briggs asked. She answered. Concisely, specifically, without embellishment, the way she'd written her account that morning. Burke watched her do it. His face had settled into something she could only describe as the expression of a man who had underestimated someone and was being made to understand the full cost of that error. "You were the diversion," he said at one point, not loudly, not as a challenge, but with a kind of involuntary acknowledgement, as if the words had left him without full authorization. "Yes," she said. "You suggested it. We heard you say so last night from the corner of this room." She looked at him steadily. "You chose me because I had no one here." Burke said nothing further. Ethan had not said much throughout the inventory. He'd stood near the door, she'd been aware of him there, that particular stillness, and she understood that he was holding himself deliberately back from Burke, giving Briggs the space to work, because he understood that what happened in this room needed to be procedural and legal, and therefore resistant to any later challenge. But when Briggs finished the inventory, and Pelham and the younger man were restrained, and Burke was being informed of the specific charges Briggs intended to bring, Ethan moved. He walked to Burke directly. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch him. He stood close enough that Burke had to look up slightly, and his voice was very even. "You knew what Lang was doing to this valley," he said. "Not just to me, to every family along this creek, the Grubers, the Mercers, the Hendricks 3 years ago." He paused. "James Hendricks was my friend. He lost everything trying to hold a claim that was his by right, and the man behind the scheme was sitting in your office collecting a salary paid by the people of this town." Another pause. "I want you to know that I know that. Whatever comes next in a court of law, I want you to know that." Burke looked at him with the face of a man who had nothing useful left to say. Ethan turned away. He moved back across the room to where Abigail stood beside the inventoried documents, and he stopped beside her. He looked at her. She looked at him. "It's not over," she said quietly. "Lang isn't here. His name is on the letter, but he'll have a lawyer construct distance. This is going to take—" "I know," he said. "It's going to take time. It's going to take the marshal and a proper proceeding and testimony from Crocker and probably the Hendricks family if they're willing." He was looking at her with that complete directness. "But the way station is in Briggs's custody. The documents are sworn into record. Burke is sitting over there knowing that everything he built with Lang just came apart at its foundation." He paused. "We did that." She looked at the room around them, at Briggs working methodically in the corner at Cale Adder, writing with careful concentration at the documents that had been used to build a trap and were now the evidence of the trap itself. "We did that," she agreed. Something shifted in his expression. Something that had been held carefully for a very long time behind the steadiness and the directness and the controlled fury and the quiet competence, something that was none of those things. Something that was just Ethan Walker looking at Abigail Carter in a derelict way station on a summer afternoon in Wyoming Territory. "You know what the worst part of the last 4 years has been," he said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "It wasn't the loneliness. I'd gotten used to that. The worst part was not having anyone to do the hard thing beside." She looked at him. The warmth in her chest, that she'd been carefully not building into anything, expanded without her permission. "You have someone now," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who hid behind indirection when the true thing was available, "if you want her." The silence between them had a different quality than any of the silences before it. "I want her," he said. Outside, a long way off, the sound of a rider approaching Briggs's third deputy, coming from town with news she could not yet hear. Inside, the light in the way station was flat and bright and ordinary, and everything that had been wrong in Red Valley for 3 years was sitting in an inventory list that Cale Adder was finishing in his careful hand. And Ethan Walker reached over and took Abigail Carter's hand. Not the way he'd taken it on the roof, not for practicality, not to help her down from somewhere, just took it and held it and did not let go. She let him. She did not look away, and she did not pull back, and for the first time since arriving in Red Valley with 1 satchel and $3 and a letter that was supposed to be a beginning. For the first time, she felt the solid, unmistakable weight of something real. The rider arrived outside. Briggs looked up. Cale opened the door. And the word that came in with the afternoon heat was a single one spoken by the deputy who'd ridden hard from the telegraph office on Main Street. "Marshall's here." Marshall Cord Hatch was not what Abigail had expected. She had built a picture in her mind on the ride back to Red Valley. A territorial marshal arriving in response to a telegraph sent at 4 in the morning would be. She'd assumed a man in motion, a man with the energy of authority, newly exercised. What stepped down from the horse outside the sheriff's office was a man of about 60, with a gray beard, trimmed close, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough situations to know that urgency and speed were not always the same thing. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Pelham and the younger operative in deputy custody. He looked at Burke, who was walking with the diminished posture of a man who had already begun the internal work of constructing his defense. Then he looked at Ethan, and then at Abigail, and his gaze on her was the kind that took a full accounting without appearing to. "Miss Carter," he said, "you wrote the telegraph." "Mr. Walker sent it," she said. "The information in it was mine." "So I'm told." He looked at the inventory document Cale Adder was carrying. "Let's go inside." What followed in Briggs's office was 2 hours of the most concentrated examination Abigail had ever undergone. Hatch asked questions the way a good teacher tests, not fishing for a particular answer, but building a structure, testing each beam as he placed it. He asked about the registry visit and what she'd seen in Crocker's face. He asked about the way station and what precisely had been said by the heavy-set man Pelham about Burke's suggestion. He asked her to reproduce the language as exactly as she could remember it. He asked about the annotated map and what she'd concluded from the color coding, and when she explained it, he asked her how she knew enough about water rights to draw that conclusion, and she told him about her father's homestead and the title loss, and he wrote something down and did not comment. Then he turned to Ethan and asked the same quality of questions in a different order, and Ethan answered with the same plain directness that she had come to understand was simply how he engaged with anything that mattered to him. At the end of 2 hours, Hatch set down his pen. "The boundary filing Lang made through his holding company is fraudulent," he said. "I can move on that through the territorial court within the week. The letter implicating Burke in a payment arrangement with Lang constitutes sufficient basis for criminal charges against both of them." He paused. "Lang himself is not here." "No," Ethan said. "He'll have been informed by now that something went wrong," Hatch said. "A man like Lang has people watching his people. When Pelham doesn't report back on schedule, Lang will know." He looked at Ethan. "He may attempt to run." "Then move on him before he does," Ethan said. "I intend to," Hatch said. He said it with a quietness that carried more weight than volume. "I've been watching Lang's operation for 14 months. This valley isn't the only place he's run this scheme. There are 4 other territories where similar patterns have been identified." He looked at Abigail. "The annotated map you found, that's the first physical documentation linking the individual cases. That map is going to matter in a federal proceeding, Miss Carter. Not just for Red Valley." She absorbed that. 4 other territories. 4 other valleys where families had been losing land to manufactured boundary disputes. 4 other places where a man with a patient, methodical plan had been dismantling the lives of people who trusted the legal record to mean what it said. "The Hendricks family," she said. "Their case, the judgment against them 3 years ago, can be reopened on the basis of fraudulent documentation," Hatch said. "It won't be fast, but it can be done. She felt Ethan beside her take a slow breath. "I'll testify," Ethan said. "To everything I have, my father's records, the original boundary surveys, everything I know about the Hendricks case." He paused. "Whatever it takes." Hatch nodded. He looked between them both. "There's one more thing," he said. "The accusation against Miss Carter, the suggestion that she took materials from the Walker Ranch. I want that formally withdrawn and the withdrawal documented before I leave Red Valley." That accusation was manufactured and used as a legal and social instrument against her. I wanted on record that it was baseless. Burke, who had been sitting in the corner of the office with the careful stillness of a man trying to occupy as little space as possible, said nothing. "Mayor Burke," Hatch said. He turned and looked at him with a patience that was more effective than anger. "You'll provide a written statement to that effect before this office closes today." Burke looked up. His face had the quality of a man at the bottom of a long fall. "Yes," he said. "Yes, all right." Abigail looked at him for a moment. This man who had dismissed her in 2 minutes, her first morning in Red Valley, who had seen in her someone without people, and decided that made her useful as a target. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the particular complicated quality of justice arriving, which is never quite as clean as the anticipation of it. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, and looked away from Burke. The sun was getting low when they finally walked out of the sheriff's office. The main street of Red Valley was doing its late afternoon business around them. Horses at the rails, men coming off their work, the smell of Hattie's diner, carrying on the warm air, and it was all so ordinary that the contrast with what had been happening inside that office for the past 3 hours was almost disorienting. Ethan stood beside her on the boardwalk. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked down the length of Main Street the way a man does when he's recalibrating what a place means to him. "It's not finished," she said. "Lang is still out there." "Hatch will move on him within the day," Ethan said. "He's got enough. The court proceedings will take months." "I know. And the Valley families, the ones on that map, they'll need to be informed. Someone will need to explain what was done and what can be challenged, and Abigail." His voice was quiet. She stopped. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was not the directness she was accustomed to. It was something rawer than that, something that was the directness with the professional surface stripped off it. "We just spent 3 hours in that office undoing what it took Lang years to build. Can you stop moving for 5 minutes?" She looked at him. Something in her chest that was always braced against the next thing loosened just slightly. "I don't stop easily," she said. "I know." The near smile. "I've noticed." He held her gaze. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." She was quiet. "All right," she said. 5 minutes. He nodded, and they stood side by side on the boardwalk in the late afternoon light. And for 5 minutes, she did not think about what came next. She let herself stand in what had been accomplished. She let herself feel the weight of the day, the way station, the inventory. Hatch's questions, Burke's diminished silence, and the fact that all of it had been done and done correctly, and was now in the hands of a system that had a reasonable chance of honoring it. It was not a feeling she had often. She had learned not to expect it. She found standing there that it was a better feeling than she'd remembered. The town knew by morning. News in Red Valley traveled the way water does, finding every available channel moving faster than you'd think possible, given the apparent stillness of the surface. By the time Abigail came downstairs for coffee, Mrs. Paulson was standing at the kitchen counter with the expression of a woman who has been revising her opinions since before sunrise and is not entirely comfortable with the process. "Miss Carter," she said, and then stopped as if she'd used up her preparation on the name. "Good morning, Mrs. Paulson," Abigail said. "I want to say—" Mrs. Paulson stopped again. She was a woman who chose words carefully and was finding this morning that the careful words were the harder ones. "I wasn't as welcoming as I might have been." "You were decent to me," Abigail said. "You gave me a room. I believed what people were saying," Mrs. Paulson said, "about you and the Walker records. I could have said something in your defense, and I didn't." She set down the coffee pot. That was wrong of me." Abigail looked at her. The older woman's hands were not entirely steady, and there was a genuine distress in her face that was not about reputation or social arithmetic. It was the distress of a person who had found herself on the wrong side of something and knew it. "You're saying something now," Abigail said. Mrs. Paulson looked up. "It's not nothing saying it now," Abigail said. "It's not the same as having said it then, but it's not nothing." She picked up her coffee cup. "Thank you, Mrs. Paulson." She went out before the older woman could find more words, because she had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do with someone's remorse was give it room to settle. Main Street was different. She noticed it as she walked, the difference in how people moved in relation to her. It was not a dramatic shift. Red Valley was not a town given to dramatic public acknowledgments. But the woman who had been cutting a wide path around Abigail Carter for 3 weeks now met her eyes when they passed on the boardwalk. Clarence Webb, the barber, stepped out of his shop and said good morning with a directness that had been absent before. 2 men she didn't know by name tipped their hats. She received all of it with the same composed expression she'd built for difficult things, because she understood that it was not really about her. It was about the town's relationship with its own behavior, and that was their private work to do, not hers to manage. Hattie's diner was the fullest she'd seen it. Clara Gruber was there at a table near the window with her children around her and her youngest on her lap, and she looked up when Abigail came in with an expression of uncomplicated relief and warmth that was different in quality from everything else Abigail had received that morning. Clara didn't say anything elaborate. She just moved the chair beside her slightly outward, in a gesture of unmistakable invitation. Abigail sat. "How are you?" Clara said. "Tired," Abigail said honestly. "Good tired or bad tired?" she considered. "The kind that means something got done." Clara nodded as if that was the right answer. She passed the bread basket. Abigail took a piece and ate it, and for a few minutes they sat in the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. "Hattie told me about the Mercer claim," Clara said eventually. "That it might be recoverable, the boundary on the east side. The marshal will need to review each case individually," Abigail said. "But the pattern is documented now. If the same method was used, manufactured document dispute, fraudulent survey amendment, it can be challenged." She paused. "It won't be fast." "I know slow," Clara said. "I've been a widow 3 years. I know how to wait." She looked at Abigail. "Is it true about Burke?" "He's been formally charged," Abigail said. Clara absorbed that. "I voted for him," she said. Not with guilt, with a kind of flat, clear-eyed inventory. "Twice." "He was convincing," Abigail said. "That's what men like that rely on." Across the diner, she was aware of conversations she couldn't fully hear, but whose direction she could feel the recalibration of a community, processing the fact that it had been operated on from the inside, that someone it had trusted had been working against it. That was not a comfortable thing for a town to sit with. It would take time. She was halfway through her coffee when Ethan came in. He saw her immediately. She saw him see her. He crossed the room without hesitation and sat across from her, and Clara Gruber looked between them with the expression of a woman who has eyes and has been paying attention. "Hatch moved before sunrise," Ethan said. He was keeping his voice low, not from secrecy, the information would be public by noon, but out of the habit of a man who respected the weight of what he was saying. "He rode for Laramie last night with Pelham and the other operative in custody. He sent a separate team ahead by telegraph to Lang's office." Abigail set down her cup. "Did they get him?" "They got him," Ethan said. "He was at his office. Apparently he'd received word that something had gone wrong in Red Valley, but didn't know the full scope. He was in the process of going through his own records when Hatch's men arrived." A pause. He thought he still had time. The thing that moved through her was not triumph. It was something quieter and more solid than that, the specific satisfaction of a pattern completed. A thing that had been wrong for years addressed. "The other territories," she said. Hatch mentioned 4 other places with similar patterns. "He'll be filing on all of them from Laramie," Ethan said. "The map you found is the connective piece. It shows the scheme operating across state lines, which moves it into federal jurisdiction. He held her gaze. "You found that map, Abigail." "We found it," she said. He didn't argue, but she could see he was filing the distinction away somewhere. Clara cleared her throat in a way that was not subtle. "I'm going to get more coffee," she announced, and went to the counter with her youngest child and made a point of speaking to Hattie at length about something that apparently required standing with her back to the table. Ethan looked at the space Clara had vacated, and then at Abigail, and the near smile arrived. "She's giving us privacy," he said. "She's not very subtle about it." Abigail agreed. "No." He turned his hat in his hands, that gesture she'd come to recognize as the physical expression of him organizing his thoughts. "I need to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "What are you going to do now?" She looked at him steadily. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the reason you were in Red Valley, the teaching position that didn't exist, it still doesn't exist. Burke's gone, but the school funding situation hasn't changed overnight." He paused. "I mean that you came here with a plan that circumstances interrupted, and now the circumstances have changed, and I want to know what you're thinking." It was a careful question. She understood the shape of it, understood what he was actually asking under the practical framing of it. He was not a man who arrived at personal territory by a direct route. He came at it sideways with practicality, as cover the way a man does when the direct route feels too exposed. She chose to meet him where he actually was, rather than where he was pretending to be. "I'm thinking," she said, "that the children in this valley have not had consistent schooling in 2 years. I'm thinking that there are at least 6 families along the Creek Road alone who have children who should be in a classroom. I'm thinking that with Burke gone and the town council needing to demonstrate it can function with integrity, a formal proposal for a school funding structure might have better reception now than it would have had 3 weeks ago." I was looking at her with full attention. "And you'd make that proposal?" "I'd make that proposal," she said. "And build the curriculum. And find the space." She paused. "I know how to build things with what the land provides." He was quiet for a moment. "The Walker Ranch has a south building," he said. "Timber frame sound structure hasn't been used as anything since my father's time. It's too far from town to be a permanent schoolhouse, but it could serve while a proper building is organized." She looked at him. "That's a generous offer." "It's a practical offer," he said with a quietness that meant the opposite. She understood that she was being asked something larger than the question on the surface. She understood that a man who had closed himself over years, who had built the careful self-sufficiency of someone who had learned not to rely on people staying, was telling her in the only language he was comfortable with that he wanted her to stay. She had not expected when she arrived in Red Valley with 1 satchel and $3 to find something like this. She had hoped because she could not stop hoping for a place to be useful, a place where her work meant something. She had not dared hope for more than that. She looked at Ethan Walker across the table in Hattie's diner, with the morning sun coming through the window and the sound of the town doing its ordinary commerce around them, and she thought about the roof in the rain and the dark road northeast and the corner of the way station and his hand finding hers in the dark. She thought about his voice saying, "I want her," and the way it had sat in the air like something placed carefully rather than dropped. "It would need to be closer to town eventually," she said. "Children can't ride 4 miles in winter weather." "Then we find a closer location eventually," he said. "The south building is for now." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay, Abigail. That's what I'm asking. The school is the practical piece. The part underneath it is—" He stopped. "I know what the part underneath it is," she said. And she thought about all the things she'd been afraid of for a long time. Being left. Being not enough. Being the person who was chosen last, if at all. She thought about Gerald Marsh's letter 3 years ago, and the school board's letter, and Burke's 2-minute dismissal of everything she was and could do. She thought about how she'd built the wall stone by careful stone against the possibility of expecting anything, and she thought about the fact that Ethan Walker had stood at the foot of the boarding house steps with his hat in his hand and said, "I don't believe you took those things," before he had any practical reason to believe it. That he had climbed onto a stranger's roof in a storm without being asked. That he had sent her name to the marshal at 4 in the morning, not because it served his case, but because someone had used her, and he wanted that on record. The wall she'd built was still there. It would not come down all at once. She did not think he was asking it to. "I'll stay," she said. The stillness that came over his face was not the controlled professional stillness she'd learned to read over the past weeks. It was something different, the stillness of a man who has braced for the answer and received the one he hoped for and is absorbing the reality of it. He said after a moment, "Good." Just that. She almost smiled. "Good," she agreed. Clara Gruber came back to the table with her coffee and looked at both of them and said nothing, which was Abigail thought the most diplomatic thing she'd done all morning. The week that followed was the strangest Abigail had experienced in Red Valley, which was a high standard given the 3 weeks before it. The formal proceedings against Lang and Burke moved with a speed that Hatch apparently considered ordinary and that everyone in Red Valley found remarkable. Burke was held in territorial custody pending a circuit court hearing. Pelham and the younger operative remained in Laramie custody. Lang's legal representatives appeared within 2 days, exactly as she'd predicted, attempting to construct a separation between their client and the documented evidence. But the letter on Lang's letterhead addressed to Burke by name was not a thing that separated easily, and the annotated map with Lang's handwriting in the margin notations was less separable still. Crocker testified to the erased registry entry and the nature of the original inquiry. He did it with the manner of a man delivering a long overdue confession, which in some ways it was. Hatch was not gentle with him, but was not punitive either. Either Crocker had been careless and possibly willfully incurious, but the evidence of active participation in the scheme was not there, and Hatch was a man who prosecuted what he could prove. Abigail gave her testimony by formal deposition, written witnessed, and submitted to the territorial court. She wrote it with the same precision she'd used for everything else, spare, exact, confined to direct observation. When the court's representative read through it and looked up, he had the expression she was beginning to recognize as standard when men encountered the quality of her documentation. "You've done this before," he said. "I've been observing carefully my whole life," she said. "I just started writing it down." The Hendricks case was referred to a separate proceeding that would take longer. James Hendricks reached by letter at the farm outside Casper, where he'd settled after losing the original claim, wrote back within a week. Ethan read the letter in his ranch office with Abigail seated across from him, and he read it twice, and then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "He says he always figured there was more to it than the court found," Ethan said. "He says he's glad someone finally looked." He stopped. "He says he doesn't blame me." "He shouldn't," Abigail said. "No," Ethan said. "But I'm glad he doesn't." She understood what the letter meant to him. Not the legal piece, which was ongoing and uncertain, but the personal one. The conversation he had needed to have with himself about James Hendricks, and whether he'd done enough carried for 3 years and now partially released. It would not fully resolve until the court proceeding did. But the letter was something. She left him with it and went to check on the South Building, which Jake Mercer had opened up and begun clearing with a thoroughness that suggested he'd decided about her in some private way and was acting on that decision. The town council convened on a Thursday, 11 days after the way station. It was a different body from the one that had operated under Burke. 2 of the 5 members had resigned, one in genuine moral distress. One in the kind of distress that comes from knowing you'll be examined closely in the period ahead and preferring not to be. The remaining 3, along with 2 newly appointed temporary members, sat at the front of the meeting room in Hattie's Diner, the largest indoor space in Red Valley, and the town filled in around them. It was the fullest meeting Abigail had ever seen in the territory. People were standing along the walls. Clara Gruber was there with her children. Crocker sat in the second row with the face of a man doing penance. Jake Mercer stood near the back with his arms crossed. And Ethan Walker sat 3 seats from Abigail, close enough that she was aware of him, distant enough that the seating arrangement said nothing about them directly. She had things to say at that meeting. She had prepared them. When the council called for matters of public interest, she stood. Every head in the room turned. She had been in Red Valley for a month. She had arrived with nothing that the town recognized as valuable and had been treated accordingly. Every person in that room had either participated in or observed the treatment, and they all knew it, and the quality of their attention now was a complicated thing. Part respect, part guilt, part the particular human fascination with someone who has been underestimated and proved the estimation wrong. She did not address any of that directly. She stood with her hands folded and her back straight and spoke clearly. She proposed a formal school district for Red Valley and the surrounding Creek Valley with dedicated funding from the town tax base and a board of 3 parents to oversee curriculum and operations. She proposed a transitional arrangement using a private donated space. She did not name Ethan, but several people's eyes moved to him while a permanent schoolhouse was planned. She outlined a curriculum and a fee structure for families who could contribute and a provision for families who could not. She spoke for 6 minutes. She did not use more words than the proposal required. When she sat down, the room was quiet. Then Clara Gruber said from her seat near the window, "I second every word." After that it went quickly. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing in Red Valley was ever unanimous because it was a town of strong-willed people who disagreed on principle, but it was decisive. 4-1 in favor of the proposal, with the one dissenting voice coming from a rancher who objected to the tax mechanism rather than the school itself and would come around within the month. Ethan, when she glanced at him, was looking at his hat in his hands, but he was almost smiling. After the meeting, people came to her in the way they hadn't in her first weeks, with questions, with offers, with the specific energy of a community that has decided something and wants to begin. A woman named Della Marsh, who had 2 children of school age, asked about the curriculum. A farmer offered lumber. One of the temporary council members wanted to discuss the fee structure. She answered every question. She wrote things down. She moved through the conversations with the efficient warmth of a woman who had spent years learning how to build something out of whatever materials were available. At some point, the room thinned. People went back to their evenings. Hattie began stacking chairs. Ethan was waiting by the door. She walked to him, and they went out together into the warm Wyoming evening, and they walked in the direction of neither the boarding house nor the ranch in particular, just walked the way 2 people do when the destination is less important than the company. After a while she said, "I want to find the Hendricks family a way back to this valley. Not just the legal case, actually back. If the claim can be restored, there's nothing for them in Casper." Howe was quiet for a moment. "James would come back," he said, "if there was something to come back to." "Then let's make sure there is," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The evening was warm and still, and the stars were beginning over the Wyoming Territory. The particular abundance of stars that belonged to this specific piece of sky, which she was beginning to think of tentatively, and without saying it aloud, as hers. "You know what you are," Ethan said. She looked at him. "You're the kind of person," he said, "who fixes the roof when nobody asks, who writes down what she sees because she understands it might matter, who comes into a town that doesn't want her, and without making a production of it, becomes the person who holds it together." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a school teacher from Cheyenne with $3, she said. "You were," he said. "That's not what you are now." She thought about asking him what he thought she was now. She decided she already knew, and that knowing was enough for tonight. "Walk me back," she said. He fell into step beside her close enough that their arms brushed at the shoulder and neither of them moved away, and the town of Red Valley settled into its evening around them. Lamps in windows, horses at rails, the distant sound of the saloon and the closer sound of crickets in the summer grass, and above it all, the enormous patient sky of the Wyoming Territory, which had seen everything and kept its counsel. She was not the woman who had arrived here a month ago. She wasn't entirely sure yet who she was becoming. But for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, she was not afraid to find out. The letter from the territorial court arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the way station. Abigail was in the South Building when Jake Mercer rode up with it. She had been there since early morning, working through the space with the focused efficiency that Jake had come to recognize as her natural operating mode. Measuring, noting, making the kind of careful assessments that preceded building something intended to last. 3 of the Valley families had sent older children to help clear the space, and they were working around her with the industrious energy of young people who have been given a task with clear purpose. Jake dismounted and handed her the envelope without comment. He'd learned in 6 weeks that she preferred information delivered directly. She looked at the seal. Territorial Court Laramie Division. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the workbench beside her and stood very still for a moment. "Good news or bad?" Jake said. "Get Ethan," she said. Jake read her face and was back on his horse in 30 seconds. She read the letter a third time while she waited. Not because the words had changed, but because she needed to be certain she was understanding them correctly. The formal language of legal documents was something she'd taught herself out of necessity. Her father's title. Loss had been the first lesson, and she'd continued the education through every precarious circumstance since. She was understanding it correctly. Ethan arrived in 15 minutes, which meant Jake had ridden fast. He came through the door of the south building with his hat in his hand and took the letter from her when she held it out. She watched his face as he read. The change in his expression was not dramatic. It was the change of a man who has been carrying weight for a very long time and has just been told formally and in writing that he can put it down. "The boundary amendment is restored," he said. "The 1879 filing is confirmed as legally valid," she said. "The fraudulent challenge is formally dismissed. The north 40 acres and creek access are uncontested Walker Ranch property." He read the second paragraph. "The Hendricks case," he said. "Reopened," she said. "Full review of the original boundary judgment. Hatch submitted the documentation from the way station as new evidence. The court granted the review within the week." She paused. "James Hendricks is going to get his day." Ethan set the letter down. He put both hands flat on the workbench and looked at them for a moment, and she understood that she was witnessing something private, the specific internal reckoning of a man setting down 3 years of carried guilt. She did not say anything. She let it happen. After a moment, he looked up. His eyes were clear and direct, and there was something in them that had not been there the morning she'd first seen him on the roof. In the rain, something that looked, she thought, like a man who had come to terms with his own history and was now able to look forward. 3 years, he said. "You moved when you could," she said. "You're moving now." "You moved," he said. "I helped." She shook her head. "We don't have to argue about who did what. It's done." He looked at her for a long moment. One of the Valley children, a boy of about 10, Delamarche's oldest, was watching from across the room with the uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't watching. Ethan straightened and put his hat back on. "I need to write to James," he said. "Write tonight," she said. "Right now, I need you to tell me whether that corner timber is load-bearing because I want to take down the partition wall, and Jake says it is, and I don't think it is." The near smile arrived. "I'll look at it," he said. He looked at it, and she was right, and Jake accepted the correction with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had been adjusting to being wrong about things since Abigail Carter arrived in the valley, and they spent the rest of the morning taking down the partition wall. The day that changed everything again came without warning, the way the important days always did. It was a Friday 2 weeks after the letter, and the South Building was close enough to ready that Abigail had set a start date for the first school session the following Monday. 12 children confirmed, 3 more likely. She had a curriculum written and supplies sourced, and the particular anticipatory energy of someone on the edge of doing the work they were built for. She was walking back from the general store where she had just arranged credit for school supplies which the storekeeper had extended without hesitation, which still surprised her slightly when she heard her name called from across the street. It was Margaret Holt. She stopped. Margaret Holt crossed to her with the determined stride of a woman who has made a decision and intends to execute it before she loses her nerve. She was carrying a covered dish. "Miss Carter," she said. She held out the dish. "It's a pie. For the school opening. I bake well, and I wanted to do something useful." She stopped. Started again. "I said things about you when you first came to Red Valley. Things I knew might not be fair, and said anyway because it cost me nothing, and I didn't think you'd be here long enough for it to matter." Her chin was up, but her voice was not entirely steady. "That was wrong. I've known it was wrong since the morning on the roof in the storm, and I didn't say so, and I'm saying so now." Abigail looked at her. Margaret Holt was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had made the choices that cost the least in the moment, and she was now paying the longer price of them, and she was doing it in public on a Friday morning on Main Street, which took more courage than the original choices had taken cowardice. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Abigail said and took the pie. Margaret Holt nodded, turned and walked away with the speed of a woman who has completed a difficult thing and needs a moment alone with it. Abigail watched her go and felt the complicated, layered thing that forgiveness always was not simple, not instant, but real. She was still standing there when Clara Gruber came alongside her, appearing from the direction of Hattie's diner. "Was that Margaret Holt bringing you a pie?" Clara said. "It was." "What kind?" Abigail looked at the dish. "I didn't ask." "It'll be peach," Clara said. She always makes peach when she's trying to atone for something. She took Abigail's arm and they walked together. The Mercer family got a letter from the court this week about their claim. "I heard," Abigail said. "Hatch's office sent preliminary notice that the review was being extended to include all cases in the valley with the same signature pattern." "Della cried," Clara said. "Not sad crying, the other kind." She paused. "The kind where you've been holding something very tight for a very long time, and someone tells you it's all right to let go." Abigail understood that kind of crying. She had not done it herself, she didn't do it easily, but she understood it. "There's something else," Clara said. Her voice had shifted to a quality that Abigail recognized as the delivery of news that requires preparation. "James Hendricks arrived this morning, from Casper." Abigail stopped walking. "He came in on the early stage," Clara said. "He's at Hattie's now. Ethan went to meet him 20 minutes ago." Ethan had read that last line and stopped, and neither of them had said anything for a while. "I'll come," Abigail said. James Hendricks was a man of about 45, with the particular quality of someone who had been through a hard thing and come out the other side still standing, but permanently marked by the crossing. He was lean-weathered with a handshake that was strong and a way of looking at people that was direct, without being challenging the look of someone who had spent time deciding what actually mattered and had stopped spending energy on the rest. I was sitting across from Ethan when Abigail came in, and the conversation they were having had the texture of one that had started somewhere difficult and was working its way through. She heard the word boundary and the word court, and then Ethan looked up and saw her. And something in his expression shifted the slight but visible relaxation of a man who is in the middle of hard territory and has just seen something familiar and good. "James," Ethan said, "this is Abigail Carter." James Hendricks looked at her with the recognition of a man who has been told about a person and is now comparing the account to the reality. "Miss Carter," he said, "you're the one who found the map." "We found it together," she said because she had decided that was the right answer and intended to keep giving it. James studied her for a moment. "Ethan's letter said you came to Red Valley with almost nothing and no one, and that Lang's people specifically chose you as the diversion because of that." He paused. "My wife and I lost our homestead 3 years ago. We had 2 children at the time. We packed what we could carry and moved to Casper because there was nothing else to do." He stopped again. "I want you to know, both of you, that whatever the court decides, the fact that someone found what happened and made it a matter of record that matters. Even if I never get the land back, it matters that someone looked." The table was quiet. Ethan said after a moment, "You'll get the land back, James." "You don't know that." "I know the evidence," Ethan said, "and I know Cord Hatch." He paused. "I should have moved faster 3 years ago." "Ethan, I'm not asking you to absolve me," Ethan said. It was direct and clean and had the quality of a man who has done his private work and is now speaking the result of it. "I'm telling you that I know I should have moved faster, and that this time I did, and that the difference," he paused and looked briefly at Abigail, "was not entirely something I did myself." James Hendricks looked between them with the particular perception of someone who has been through enough to read a room. He said nothing about what he saw there because he was, she thought, a man who knew which things were his to comment on. What he said instead was, "My wife wants to come back. She's been saying it since the first winter in Casper. She said the valley was the first place she felt like she belonged somewhere." He looked at his hands. I told her maybe. Now I'm telling her yes. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Then Hattie appeared from the kitchen with coffee and a plate of something, and the practical interruption of it broke the weight of the moment in the way that Hattie had an instinct for a capacity for appearing with exactly what was needed, precisely when it was needed, which Abigail had come to believe was a genuine form of intelligence. The Sunday before the school opened, something happened that Abigail had not anticipated and would remember for the rest of her life. She was at the South Building, doing a final check, the kind a person does when they have built something and are on the verge of finding out whether it holds. The space was ready. The benches were built by a local carpenter who had offered his labor as a contribution and whose quality of work she respected. The books were organized. The chalk was on the ledge. Everything was as it should be. She was alone in the space, and the afternoon was warm and still, and she was standing in the middle of the room doing nothing in particular, just standing in it, feeling its readiness, when she heard boots on the step outside. Ethan came in without knocking. He looked around the room with the assessment of a man who has seen the space transform over 6 weeks and is taking in its completed state. It's good, he said. It'll do, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The late afternoon light came in from the western window and fell in a long slant across the floor between them. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she understood this was not a practical question. He was organizing language for something that mattered, and he was doing it with the deliberate care of a man for whom words were not casual instruments. When you came to Red Valley, he said, you were looking for a place to do your work, a place to build something. He paused. I want to know if you found that. She looked at him steadily. You know the answer to that. I know part of the answer, he said. I'm asking about the rest. The rest. She understood exactly what he meant by the rest. She had stayed in this boarding house for 6 weeks. She had not discussed the arrangement, what it was or wasn't, because there had always been the next practical thing requiring attention. The proceedings. The school. The community. She had kept moving the way she always did, because moving was how she'd survived, and the habit was not easily broken. But she was standing in a room she had built in a valley she had come to know, and Ethan Walker was looking at her with the full weight of what he actually meant, and she was done hiding from it in practicality. The work, she said, is here. The place is here. She held his gaze. The people she stopped, started again. The person I want to be near is here. The thing that crossed his face was not the near smile. It was the full thing, and it transformed him completely, the way a rare thing transforms a landscape when it finally arrives. She had suspected in glimpses that it existed. Seeing it directly was something else. He crossed the room to her in 3 steps and stopped close, and he looked at her the way he had on the roof in the rain, not assessing, not calculating, and he said, I want to ask you something else. You already said that, she said. This is the other one, he said. She waited. I want to ask if you'll stay, not at the boarding house, not as the school teacher who uses the South Building. He paused. I want to ask if you'll stay at the ranch, with me. He stopped, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked less than entirely certain, which was so unusual that it moved her more than certainty would have. As the person who matters most to me, he finished. Whatever the right word for that is, whatever you want the word to be. She was quiet for a breath. She thought about all the things that could be said here, the practical objections, the social considerations, the speed of it, the improbability of it, the ways a person who had been left before learned to be careful. She thought about Gerald Marsh's letter, and her father's homestead, and the school board in Cheyenne, and Burke's 2-minute dismissal, and every accumulated evidence that she was not the person who got chosen. And then she thought about a man climbing onto a stranger's roof in a summer storm without being asked. A man who listened to all of it and trusted her account before he had any reason to. A man who sent her name to the marshal at 4 a.m. because someone had used her and he wanted that on record. A man who said, I want her in a derelict way station with his face open and certain. She thought about all of that, and she made her decision, and it was not a frightened decision, and it was not a desperate one, and it was not built on need alone. It was built on something solid, something that had been built between them the way good structures are built slowly with tested materials, in conditions that revealed the weakness of anything that wasn't true. "The word is yes," she said. He reached out and put his hand along her face, that large, careful hand that had taken hers in the dark and passed her a cold coffee cup on a broken boardwalk, and he held it there like something precious. "Abigail Carter," he said. "Ethan Walker," she said. He kissed her the way he did everything, with full attention and without excess, as if it were the exact thing the moment required, and nothing more and nothing less. And it was exactly that. They were married on the last Saturday in September, when the Wyoming summer had softened into the first edge of autumn, and the morning had the particular clarity of air that has released its heat without yet acquiring its winter cold. It was not a large ceremony. Abigail did not want large. She had spent a lifetime among people who looked through her, and what she wanted now was not to be looked at by many. She wanted to be seen fully by the ones who actually knew her. And so it was the people who did. Clara Gruber stood beside her. Jake Mercer stood beside Ethan. Hattie came and sat in the front with her good apron on. James Hendricks was there, and his wife, who had arrived from Casper 2 weeks before with their children, and the particular brightness of someone returning to a place they'd given up hoping to see again. Mrs. Paulson came and sat in the second row and cried with a genuine feeling that was itself a kind of apology. Even Della Marsh's oldest boy came, the 10-year-old who had watched everything from across the South Building on the day of the court letter, and who had turned out to be one of the best students in the first session of the Red Valley School. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a spare man named Gideon Cole, who had the gift of brevity that Abigail particularly valued in a speaker. He said what needed to be said and did not elaborate beyond necessity. When it was done, and Ethan held her hand in front of everyone who mattered, she felt something that she had not known until she felt it. She had been missing. Not belonging to someone she had never needed that, but belonging somewhere. The solid, quiet, unmistakable experience of having found a place where she was not tolerated, not useful, not the last choice, but simply wanted, known, chosen without reservation by a man who understood exactly what he was choosing. That was what she had not known she could have until she had it. The court decision on the Hendricks case came in November. She was teaching when Jake came to the door of the school building. The real building now, a proper timber structure on the south edge of Main Street, built in 3 weeks in October by every able-bodied man in the valley who had chosen to show up, which was most of them. She was mid-sentence in a geography lesson when Jake appeared and waited in the doorway with a patience that meant the news was good rather than urgent. She looked at her students. "Copy the next 2 pages," she said, quietly, and went to the door. "Territorial court upheld the review," Jake said. "Hendricks' claim restored. The 1878 boundary judgment is vacated." He paused. "Full land and water rights returned to the original claimant." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "Thank you, Jake," she said. He nodded, touched his hat, and walked away with the unhurried stride of a man who has delivered good news and is satisfied with that work. She went back inside. Her students looked up from their copying 12 faces, ranging from 7 to 14, the children of farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers and one widow, every one of them there because someone had decided their education was worth fighting for. "All right," she said. "Let's continue." It was Ethan who told James. He rode out to the Hendricks place that afternoon, the claim that James had come back to in October, staying in the remnants of the original structure, while he worked to rebuild what 3 years of vacancy and weather had taken from it. Ethan rode out and told him, and James stood in the yard of his own land hearing the news, and he did not say much. What he did was reach out and grip Ethan's hand in both of his and hold it for a moment. Ethan told her about it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in the ranch house while she graded the day's copywork by lamplight. "He cried," Ethan said. She looked up. "James Hendricks," he said. "He stood in his own yard and cried." He was looking at the table. "I don't think I've ever seen him cry. Not in all the years I've known him." She set down the copywork. "How did that feel?" she said. I was quiet for a moment. "Like something being set right," he said. "Not perfectly. It cost him 3 years he won't get back. But right." He looked up. "Like something I was supposed to do and didn't do fast enough and finally got done." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that in the lamplight without speaking, and outside the Wyoming autumn pressed quietly against the walls of the house, and the house held the way. A well-built thing holds not because nothing has ever tested it, but because it was put together from true materials by people who intended it to last. The story that people told about Red Valley in the years that followed was not one single story. It was several, depending on who was telling it and what part they had lived. Some told it as the story of Victor Lang and the land scheme that came apart when it was finally examined. Some told it as the story of Aldous Burke and what happened to a man who spent too long measuring his choices by what they cost him in the moment, rather than what they cost everyone else over time. Some told it as the story of James and Sarah Hendricks coming back to their land, which became in the years that followed one of the most productive creekfront operations in the valley. But the version that lasted, the one that moved through the community and got passed from person to person, the way only the true stories do, was simpler than any of those. It was the story of a woman who had arrived in the summer with 1 satchel and $3 and a letter of recommendation for a position that didn't exist, and who had been called the last choice, and the woman with nothing, and the woman nobody wanted, and who had, without making a production of it, without asking for recognition, without waiting for someone to decide she was worthy, done the work that needed doing, and built the things that needed building, and stood in the truth when the truth was costly. And it was the story of a man who had closed himself off from people for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone beside him in the hard territory, who had climbed onto a stranger's roof in a storm without being asked because he saw someone doing a necessary thing and understood that kind of person was rare. People in Red Valley in the years that followed would point out the schoolhouse on the south end of Main Street and say that started in a south building on the Walker Ranch. Did you know that a schoolteacher from Cheyenne built it from nothing? And sometimes they would add, and the man who owned the ranch helped her, and then he married her, and then the valley got its water rights back, and the Hendricks family came home, and the creek road filled up with good people building good lives. What they did not add, because it was the kind of thing that does not translate well into the telling, was what it looked like. The evening of the last Saturday in September, when Ethan Walker stood in front of the people he trusted most and looked at Abigail Carter, the way a man looks when he finally understands that belonging somewhere is not about the land under your feet. It is about who stands beside you on it. And she had been standing there all along. She had walked into Red Valley as nobody's first choice and become in the end the only choice that mattered. Not because someone rescued her, not because she waited to be found, but because she had climbed onto every hard roof that needed climbing, written down everything that needed to be recorded, and refused through all of it to stop believing that the work was worth doing. That was who she was. And Red Valley, which had once called her the woman with nothing, learned, slowly, imperfectly, the way communities always learn, that a woman who builds things from nothing is not a woman with nothing. She is the most valuable thing a